You replay conversations that ended 3 days ago, not because something went wrong, but because you are trying to understand why it went the way it did. You run through the decision you made last Tuesday, not because you regret it, but because you are still mapping the chain of consequences that branched from it. Before you send a single message, you have already read it from 4 different angles, considered how each word might land, and rewritten it twice. Not because you are afraid, because your mind refuses to release a thing until it has been fully examined. That process has a name. The name is overthinking, and everywhere you have ever gone, school, work, relationships, therapy, intake forms, it has been handed back to you as a problem, something to manage, something to medicate, something that signals a mind that is working too hard and achieving too little. Here is what no one has told you yet. The problem was never the thinking. The problem was that you were handed a mind built for depth and placed into environments that were built for speed. You were given an instrument calibrated for precision and then criticized when it failed to perform like a blunt tool. Overthinking is not a disorder. It is a capability with no instruction manual. And the difference between that capability destroying you quietly from the inside and becoming the most precise tool you have ever used, that difference is not therapy. It is not medication, and it is not learning to let things go. It is understanding what this thing actually is. However it started, you received the same message across multiple contexts, delivered by different people in different tones, but always carrying the same meaning. The way your mind works is an inconvenience, and so the history of this trait is not the history of a flaw developing. It is the history of a capacity being systematically misread. Every time you paused before answering, someone filled the silence with their assumption. Every time you circled back to a conversation to understand it more clearly, someone accused you of being unable to let things go. Every time you asked a question that cut below the surface of what everyone else had already accepted, you were told you were making things complicated. Across relationships, this pattern followed you like a tax. In friendships, your desire to understand, rather than just react, made you seem emotionally unavailable. Even when you were doing the opposite of disengaging, you were processing at depth while they were processing at volume. In romantic relationships, your careful analysis of what was happening between you read as coldness, as withdrawal, as proof that you were not fully present. At work, your refusal to commit to a decision before you had fully examined it made you look indecisive to people who confused speed with competence. And in every one of those environments, the solution offered to you was the same: think less. Here is the internal monologue you run when this trait surfaces. You know it already, but hear it said aloud. Something happens, a conversation, a decision, an interaction with another person, and immediately your mind begins its process. You start pulling at the threads. You ask yourself what the person actually meant versus what they said. You wonder what prior experience of theirs shaped that response. You consider whether your read is accurate or whether you are projecting. You run the scenario forward and backward, looking for the shape of it, for the logic that connects the pieces. And then, somewhere in the middle of that process, a second voice enters. It says, "You are doing this again. You are making it too complicated. Nobody else is thinking this hard about this. There is something wrong with you." And so you do what you have always done when the second voice gets loud enough. You stop. You suppress the analysis. You force yourself to respond the way a person who does not think this much would respond. You perform simplicity. You produce the quick answer, the easy read, the surface-level response that costs you nothing and tells the other person nothing real. And for a moment, it works. The conversation flows. Nobody looks at you strangely. You have passed. But you know what you did. You know the answer you gave was not the accurate one. You know the decision you made was not the examined one. And that knowledge sits in you afterward, not as guilt, but as a specific kind of dissatisfaction. The dissatisfaction of a person who translated their own thought into a language that was easier for someone else to hear, and in doing so, lost the original. This is what overthinking has cost you, across years, across contexts, across relationships. Not time, not productivity, not peace of mind. It has cost you the right to be fully legible to yourself. Because every time you suppressed the process to fit the room, you taught yourself that the room's comfort mattered more than your accuracy. The real question underneath all of this is not whether you are normal. Normal is a statistical average, and it has never once described how you actually work. The real question is this: what does it mean that your mind refuses to stop at the surface? And why has everyone you trusted told you that refusal is the problem? The word overthinking contains a judgment baked into its structure. The prefix over is not neutral. It means too much. It means in excess of what is appropriate. When you accept the label of overthinking, you are accepting the premise embedded in it, that there is a correct quantity of thinking, that you have exceeded it, and that your excess is the source of your difficulty. But who set the limit? Who decided what constituted the appropriate amount of thinking before a decision should be made, before a conversation should be evaluated, before a conclusion should be drawn? The answer, when you trace it back, is not psychologists and not researchers. The answer is a culture that prizes output over accuracy, confidence over correctness, and the appearance of decisiveness over the substance of sound judgment. The people who coined the term overthinking were not describing a pathology. They were describing their own discomfort with watching someone think longer than they did. The label is not a clinical observation. It is an expression of impatience dressed up as diagnosis. What you actually do is not overthinking. It is thorough analysis. It is cognitive depth. It is the process of a mind that refuses to settle for the first available conclusion and keeps working until it finds the accurate one. The word you have been using is the wrong word, and the wrong word has been doing real damage because you cannot accurately treat a thing you have mislabeled. The label was never about your mind. It was always about their patience. This trait does not appear from nowhere. Analytical depth, the tendency to examine things at multiple levels simultaneously, to hold competing interpretations at once, to distrust surface readings. This is a trait that develops in specific conditions, and the most common of those conditions is an environment in which the surface was not safe. Children who grew up in households where moods shifted without warning, where what was said did not match what was meant, where reading the room was not a social skill but a survival strategy. These learned, developed early and robust pattern recognition systems. They learned to track multiple variables simultaneously. They learned to distrust first impressions. They learned that the stated reason for something was rarely the actual reason, and that safety came from understanding the system beneath the surface before committing to a position. That skill did not disappear when the environment changed. It became the operating system. What you call overthinking is the residue of a mind that learned, under real conditions, that careful analysis was protective. The mechanism served you. The problem is that it is still running full capacity in contexts that no longer require that level of vigilance. But here is the critical distinction that most accounts of this miss. The origin of a trait does not determine its value. The fact that analytical depth developed as a coping mechanism does not make it a coping mechanism. A muscle built to lift heavy things is still a muscle, regardless of whether the original weight was optional. Your mind built this instrument under pressure. That does not make the instrument any less real. When someone tells you that you are overthinking, they are making a claim about the correct depth at which a thing should be examined. That claim is worth examining. The people most likely to tell you that you think too much are the people who have built their self-image around the ability to decide quickly. Speed is their currency. Confidence is their armor. For them, hesitation is not a sign of care. It is a sign of weakness. And watching you take time, watching you circle back, watching you refuse to close a question they have already moved past, that watching produces something in them that is not concern for your well-being. It produces anxiety. Because your refusal to settle is, implicitly a challenge to their willingness to settle. Your depth. This is a mirror they did not ask to look into. And the easiest response to an uncomfortable mirror is to tell the mirror it is broken. This is not an excuse to dismiss all feedback. Some people who note your analytical tendencies are doing so with genuine care, from inside a relationship where they have watched the process hurt you. That is different from the casual dismissal of someone who simply cannot tolerate the pace at which you operate. The distinction is this: people who care about you describe what they observe. People who are threatened by you prescribe what you should become. The speed at which someone tells you to think less is usually in direct proportion to the depth of what your thinking threatens to expose. The capacity for thorough analysis, when it is not being suppressed, produces specific and measurable advantages that are not available to people who do not process this way. You catch things not because you are smarter in any global sense, but because you stayed in the problem longer and the problem disclosed itself to you. Errors in reasoning, gaps in logic, the assumption that everyone else treated as a given and never questioned. These become visible to a mind that refuses to stop at the first available answer. In environments that require precision, legal analysis, engineering, diagnosis, research, strategy, this is not a liability. It is the primary qualification. You are also significantly harder to deceive. A person who reads only surface signals can be misled by confident presentation. You do not read only surface signals. You track the distance between what is said and what is demonstrated, between stated motivation and actual behavior, between the logic someone presents and the conclusion it actually supports. This makes you a difficult target for manipulation, for bad arguments, and for the kind of social pressure Hat operates by making dissent feel socially costly. And in relationships, when you are not performing simplicity to fit the room, you are the person who actually understood, not the person who nodded and moved on, the person who sat with what was said long enough to find the thing underneath it. That is rare, and the people who have experienced it from you know exactly what it is worth. The advantage of a mind like yours is not speed, it is depth. And depth finds things that speed drives past. The difference between this trait working against you and working for you is not a matter of thinking less. It is a matter of direction. When analytical depth is suppressed, when you silence the process because the room is impatient, when you perform the quick answer to avoid the social cost of your actual answer, the analysis does not stop. It turns inward. With no external problem to work on, a mind calibrated for examination examines the only thing left in the room: you. Your decisions, your failures, your inadequacies, your past interactions. This is the version that feels like the disorder. This is the loop, the rumination, the 3 a.m. reconstruction of a conversation from 2 weeks ago. This is what happens to a precision instrument when you point it at nothing useful. When the same capacity is directed, when it has a real problem, a genuine question, a system worth understanding, it does not feel like suffering. It feels like purpose. The same process that spent 3 hours dissecting an ambiguous text message will spend 3 hours inside a complex problem and emerge with something that could not have been reached any other way. The question has never been how to think less. The question has always been, what are you pointing this at? A mind built for depth does not need to be quieted. It needs to be aimed. The first change is internal, and it is specific. You are going to stop using the word overthinking to describe what you do, not because language is magic, and not because renaming a thing changes it. Because the word you use when you describe your own process to yourself determines the posture you take toward it. And the word overthinking instructs you to apologize. Here is the replacement. When you notice the process running, when the analysis is moving, when you are tracking multiple variables, when you are sitting inside a problem longer than the people around you, the internal label is not "I am overthinking this." The label is "I am examining this." Examination is what you do. Examination is a legitimate cognitive activity. Examination does not require your apology. When you call it overthinking, you position yourself as someone with a malfunction to manage. When you call it examination, you position yourself as someone doing work. These are not the same posture, and the posture you hold shapes the result you produce. The second replacement is for the self-directed version. The loop, the rumination, the inward spiral. When you catch the process turned on itself, the label is not, "I am overthinking again." The label is, "I am examining without a target," and that label contains the fix. Because the solution to examination without a target is not to stop examining, it is to find a target. What problem is actually in front of you right now? What decision actually requires this level of analysis? What question is genuinely worth this much of your time? Redirect the process. Give it something real to work on. The loop does not stop when you order it to stop. It stops when it has something more useful to do. Not every environment deserves your full capacity. Some environments are built for speed, run on consensus, and treat deviation from the group's pace as disloyalty. In those environments, your trait will always be a tax. You will always be too slow, too careful, too thorough for the speed at which the room is operating. That is not a personal failure. That is an architectural mismatch. The audit is this. Sort the environments in your life into two categories. Category 1, environments where the problem is real, where accuracy matters more than pace, where a wrong conclusion costs something actual. These are the environments where you are not just functional but necessary. This is where you operate without apology. Category 2, environments where the problem is social, where the correct answer is less important than the comfortable answer, where speed and confidence are the primary currencies. These are the environments where your full capacity is not required, where operating at partial depth is not betrayal of yourself, but strategic resource management. You owe it to yourself to know which rooms are worth it. The deeper part of this audit is about the people, not just the places. Which relationships in your life have room for the way your mind works? Which relationships have consistently required you to translate yourself into something simpler? This is not about cutting people off. It is about accurate accounting. You should know, without having to think about it, which spaces expand you and which ones require you to compress. The next time someone tells you that you are overthinking, in a meeting, in a conversation, in a relationship, you do not need to defend yourself, and you do not need to agree. You need 2 sentences. The first sentence acknowledges what they have observed without accepting the judgment embedded in it. Something like, "I take more time with this than you do." That is factual. That is not an apology. The second sentence redirects to outcome. That has produced accurate results. Foe. Army in situations where it mattered. Also factual. Also not an apology. These 2 sentences do not require a debate. They do not invite a counter-argument. They state a fact and point to evidence. What the other person does with that is their business. You are not in the room to convert them to a different view of how minds should work. You are in the room to operate with integrity, do your work, and decline to absorb a label that was never accurate. The key shift here is this. You do not explain yourself. Explanation implies that you are still considering the possibility that they are right and you are wrong. You are not. You are an analyst in a room of people who prefer a faster process. That is a difference of style. It is not a moral failing, and it does not require a defense. Ownership is not pride. Pride is performance. Pride wants to be witnessed. Ownership is quieter than that. Ownership is the internal posture of a person who has stopped waiting for permission to function as they actually function. The person who has ownership of this trait does not announce it. They do not preface their careful analysis with disclaimers. They do not apologize for the time they take before responding. They do not frame their depth as a quirk or a burden or an explanation for their difficulty fitting in. They do their work. They take the time the problem requires. They produce the result that the depth of their process makes possible. And when the result is accurate, When the thing they saw that others missed turns out to be real, when the decision they took time on turns out to be the correct one, when the analysis they ran turns out to have mattered. They do not perform modesty about it. They simply note it, internally, for the purpose of trusting themselves more the next time. Ownership is the practice of trusting your own process enough to stop editing it for an audience that was never going to appreciate the original anyway. Stop waiting for the room to validate what your mind already knows how to do. Here is the larger pattern. Stated plainly, you have been measuring yourself against a standard that was designed for a mind that works differently than yours. The standard was built around cognitive speed, social fluency, and the ability to produce a confident answer before the question is fully formed. Those are real skills. They are useful in certain contexts. They are not the only skills that matter, and they are not the skills your mind was built around. The culture you grew up in does not have a coherent framework for what you are. It has a framework for productivity, for output, for visible momentum. It does not have a framework for the person who sits with a problem until the problem gives up its actual structure. It does not have a framework for the mind that refuses to accept the first available answer, that tracks the distance between what is said and what is true, that runs the full analysis before committing to a position. In the absence of a framework, it gave you a label, and the label said, broken. That was the wrong assessment, not as an opinion, as a factual error. You were not broken. You were miscategorized. You were placed in environments that had no use for your particular instrument, and told that the instrument's failure to perform like a blunt tool was evidence of a defect in the instrument. Here is what is actually true about you right now. You have a mind that processes at depth. You have spent years apologizing for that, suppressing it, performing a simpler version of yourself in rooms that demanded simplicity. You have paid for that performance in the specific currency of people who process this way. Always pay. Not in failure, but in the chronic low-level dissatisfaction of a person who has never been fully legible, even to themselves. That is not a character assessment. That is a description of the conditions you have operated under. The conditions can change, not because the world will suddenly begin valuing careful analysis over confident speed. It will not. But because you can stop requiring the world's permission to operate the way you actually operate. You can stop waiting for someone to hand you a framework that fits and start building your life around the framework that is already running inside you. You are not someone who thinks too much. You are someone who thinks thoroughly, in a culture that built its institutions around people who think quickly. That is not a disorder. That is a displacement problem. And displacement problems have solutions that have nothing to do with becoming smaller. The work is not to think less. The work is to stop apologizing for the size of your mind, find the problems that are worth its full capacity, and aim it there, without flinching. That is not a pep talk. That is a description of the only path that has ever actually worked for a mind like yours. The problem was never that you thought too much. The problem was that nobody taught you what to do with it.